Good evening. It is Monday night, July 8th. Welcome to College Football Primetime, joined as always by Jonathan Rivers. I am Josh Pate. We are 13 minutes away, my friend, for the exclusive preseason unveiling of the JP poll. We'll also break down Virginia Tech Bama as well as Georgia Clemson. But first, it's time for Cover 5. First up this evening, the much-publicized offseason of Johnny Manziel has included everything from courtside NBA sightings to leaked nightclub photos to first pitches at Major League Baseball games. So, Jonathan, let's kick it off with this. Does this offseason come back to bite Johnny Manziel and, more importantly, the Aggies football program once the season kicks off this fall?
Well, I think it can, Josh, but it depends on how they handle it. With the success that Texas A&M had in their first season in the SEC, how do you present an encore? What do you do to get better in terms of watching film, in terms of recruiting, in terms of Kevin Sumlin understanding that he may be one of the best coaches in this conference and running with it? Now, remember, it's not just the Johnny Manziel show. It's an Aggie show. And if it's an Aggie show, that means his teammates have to be there to back him up as well. So I think if they come out with the right mindset and ready to hit somebody in the mouth, they'll be okay.
What you basically did there is you read the script that they've been repeating ad nauseum in College Station all offseason. The bottom line here, and a lot of people don't like to hear this, it's all about winning. As long as you win, that forgives a myriad of sins, especially in the SEC. What happens, and let's just hypothetically say Bama goes in there week 3 and they beat A&M. What happens if, heaven forbid, this conference, and more specifically the highest paid defensive coordinators in the country, catch up with you this fall? What happens if Johnny Manziel is not able to duplicate the success that he enjoyed as a first-year starter last year? What if you encounter that sophomore slump, that much fabled sophomore slump? If you do, then that bubble pops. And so far, as much criticism as he's encountered, it's all been external. It's all been of the national variety. You've had a safe haven, Johnny Manziel, so far in College Station. You've had that bubble, so to speak, to live in. If that bubble pops, if things go sideways, believe me, that bubble will pop, then the dream becomes a nightmare very quickly, and those dominoes start to tumble, in my opinion.
And you know, it's amazing, Josh. There's a team in this conference that has won a national championship 3 out of the last 4 years. And the team that may be getting the most publicity is a 10-2 team. And I think, again, when you win early in the SEC, they expect you to win often. Now, what may you hear if they have a 7-game, 7-win season this year or an 8-win season? Oh, it's been a failure. It was a failure because now you're regressing. And now you'll hear the chirpings and the murmurings of, does Texas A&M really belong in the SEC? What happened when they came to the SEC? Which is invalid in my point, but you'll still hear it.
Yeah, a year from now we would be sitting here asking, one-year wonder? Is that all A&M was? One-year wonder? Kevin Sumlin, whose stock has dropped further? I digress, though. Cover 2. The SEC spring meetings wrapped up last month in Destin, Florida. The coaches, by the way, surprising result here to me, voted overwhelmingly 13-1 against expansion to a 9-game conference schedule. Now, in the end, this will not matter because athletic directors and presidents and more specifically television executives will ultimately decide the fate of this conference as it relates to scheduling. That being said, though, were you as surprised as I was by this outcome?
I was very surprised. When you have a league such as the SEC, who has predicated themselves on having high-level competition, high-level players, and playing the toughest schedule, why would you take away one of the 3 factors that have made you the best? And if you don't go to a 9-game schedule and the rest of the country does, now you're playing catch-up. And that's not something I can say the SEC has had to do over the past decade.
It's disappointing to me because this league and the coaches and the administrators and from the top on down, I believe this has been a league that's prided itself very much on being proactive as opposed to reactive, sort of that windshield mentality, as opposed to kind of living in the rearview mirror. Let me pose a scenario for you, because this is very likely to happen. Let's say 2014 rolls around. We know that we have a new playoff format rapidly approaching. That playoff field, that 4-team, at least to start playoff field, will be decided by what? A committee. And a committee made up not just of members from the SEC, but nationally, from Oregon to Florida, from California to New York. Outside of this conference, I can tell you right now with absolute certainty, people hate the 7-game BCS title streak that this conference has enjoyed. They hate the success that, and more importantly, in terms of administrators, the paychecks that have been cashed as a result of that on-the-field success that this conference has enjoyed. What if you have, all things equal, the SEC refusing to move to a 9-game conference schedule, and at the end of the season you have a South Carolina and an Ohio State with a mirror image resume. You have an Alabama and an Oregon mirror image resumes. Do you know, and I think you do, I don't think a lot of people out there fully understand yet, they will though, how badly people want to be able to have that ammunition in their back pockets to pull out and say, at the end of the day, Tiebreaker, we got to decide this somehow. Paper, rock, scissors? No. Flip a coin? No. What we're going to do is Oregon, Pac-12? Well, you were brave enough to play a 9-game conference schedule, whereas you down in the SEC, you tucked your tail between your legs and you went with an 8-game conference schedule. So at the end of the day, you have freedom of choice to make that decision. However, you don't have freedom of consequence, and we're going to take it upon ourselves to punish you. That can happen, and that will happen if a more proactive approach is not adopted by the people that make the decisions in this conference.
And Josh, you've heard the adage, you play to win, you don't play not to lose. And if the SEC doesn't decide to go to a 9-game schedule, that's what they're doing. They're playing not to lose. Les Miles had a statement early on in the year saying, I'm not sure what this will mean in terms of national championship ramifications. Your national championship is won in college football every week. That's the great thing about this sport. Every week can be the week that you're out of the running. But you can stay in the running if you're the SEC because A, you have the best talent. B, you have the most competitive nature in this country. But you have to make sure that you're playing the same number of conference schedules. Like you said, Josh, they're looking for a reason.
Yeah, keep an eye on this moving forward. It does affect you, the fan, by the way. Cover 3, Auburn 3-9 last year. Not a conference win to be found. Out with Gene Chizik, in with Gus Malzahn. Now, there's been a lot of enthusiasm on the Plains. It hasn't quite been received as positively outside of Auburn, Alabama. I ask you, though, are you a believer in Gus Malzahn and his ability to return Auburn to prominence in the SEC and nationally?
I am a believer. If you look at Gus Malzahn, just being the coach that he is, understanding what he does best and how to get the players to do what they do best. He's been a coordinator in the SEC before. Like you stated, he's been a head coach at Arkansas State. And now it's about relationships. And again, I say, who recruited most of the players that are now on the Auburn roster? Gus Malzahn. And, of course, being the offensive guru that he is, that's going to be his first priority. Now, a good thing they did was recruiting. Nobody ever expected Auburn to have a top 11 or top 12 recruiting class. So what they've done, they've gotten depth, they've gotten younger, but now you have to put all of those ingredients in a pot and make them taste good.
Listen, people, I just want you, let me wrap this up for you this way. Let me put a bow around it. Just pretend Chip Kelly left Oregon and went to Auburn instead of Philadelphia. Because to me, that's basically the way I look at this. Because I think of Gus Malzahn offensively, you mentioned that genius moniker. It's thrown around very loosely. It absolutely applies here. And I ask this to people that say, no, he can't win at Auburn because now this is the SEC. He was at Arkansas State last year, correct? Correct. And he won the Sun Belt in his first and only year in that conference, correct?
Yes.
Could anybody out there, detractors, if you will, tell me what advantage did this guy have in rural Arkansas, at Jonesboro, at Arkansas State? Because you say it like, well, he had everything going for him there, but this is the SEC now. No. All things were equal, and the cream rose. All things are equal down here. No one's asking Gus Malzahn to take Arkansas State and win in the SEC. He has now been given a vehicle that goes just as fast as Auburn, or Alabama rather, just as fast as Georgia, just as fast as LSU, as long as you got the right guy behind the wheel. I believe they do now. All things equal, the cream will rise. Geographically, they are in a recruiting hotbed. He will get his players to run his system. Keep an eye on Brandon Harris in Bossier City, Louisiana, quarterback, by the way. If they get him, that expedites this process. But also, facilities, top-notch at Auburn, recruiting budget, just resources in general. They've got everything it takes to win. I believe he returns them very quickly to not only conference prominence and also that SEC title discussion, but also BCS title discussion as well. Take 4. And this is kind of related to what we were just talking about. I'm going to ask you to buy stock in one program in this conference. I'll make it real quick for you. Auburn is my pick for every reason I just mentioned. Buy stock in one program over, say, the next 5 years.
Well, I really like to buy stock in the Vanderbilt Commodores. I'm saying it on the air, Vanderbilt. I'm not talking about Tennessee or any other team. When you look at what they've done, you haven't seen Vanderbilt make a big splash in the recruiting trail. But what do you see, Josh? You see Vanderbilt along with USC and in Alabama. They may not land that recruit, but now they're in the running, a point that you've made. So I think with James Franklin, who is one of the best young coaches in the SEC, I think you'll see Vanderbilt doing a great job. Last year they had 8 wins. You may see 9 this year. We just have to see how they perform offensively and defensively.
We'll wrap it up with cover 5. Marshall Morgan, Georgia place kicker, arrested last weekend, BUI, boating under the influence. We're not going to throw around that tired debate of has Mark Richt lost control of this program. Basically, it's my opinion that you have what you have. It is what it is with Mark Richt and Georgia. Off season, you're going to have some nasty headlines. You're going to have a black eye on the program. They're going to be solid come fall. They're going to win enough to keep Mark Richt around. But let me ask you this. Does he deserve at least the level of criticism that he gets? Because a lot has come out lately about Urban Meyer and his time down at Florida, that 08 national title team. 34% of the players on that roster have been arrested, 12 felonies, 30 arrests overall in Urban Meyer's tenure in Gainesville, but he won championships.
It's amazing because in this conference, you either live by the sword or you die by the sword. You can't have a coach who averages 10 wins a season, but he doesn't have that hardware. He doesn't have that national championship, and without that national championship comes the criticism. Is it right? Maybe not, but that's life in the SEC, Josh.
And my, how quickly that narrative could shift.
Yeah.
Georgia, that front-loaded nature of their schedule, they played 3 top 10 caliber teams in the first 4 games of their season. Meanwhile, forget the AP, forget the BCS altogether, forget the coaches poll, definitely. We have everything you need to know. Other side of the break, the exclusive preseason unveiling of the JP poll. It is College Football Primetime. We'll be back. And welcome back to College Football Primetime, 12 past the hour, and without further hesitation or ado, my friend, I hope you're ready. I am, and I know the millions and millions of College Football Primetime fans at home already. It is the much anticipated preseason debut of the JP poll. And let's go to work. What the Jerry Lawler strap pull down was to professional wrestling, this microphone is to this show.
First of all, we see the pull that someone has and obviously doesn't have when they have a microphone from the 1930s on their desk.
Yeah, and never mind the fact it's not plugged in. Doesn't really matter. If you look good, you are good.
Okay, well, let me ask you this about your JP poll. What makes it so different from the millions and millions of other polls that are out there?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. Sincerely, I am, because number one, it's named after me, which should be reason enough, I would think. But if that's not enough, number two, I don't factor in anything other than my opinion to this poll. I don't factor in your ranking in the AP, the coaches. I don't care about your record. All I care about is eyeball test. How good do I think you are? You'll notice at various points in the season, I'll have 1 or 2 lost teams ahead of undefeated teams. You'll see very early on, I got A&M at number 10. You'll see I don't really care about what you did last year. It is how good do I think you're going to be? And really, the least confident I am in this thing, honestly, is the preseason edition. But we'll kick it off right here. Number 10. Texas A&M, we're going to go 10-1, and it's all about adjustments. We mentioned that sophomore slump, at least the potential, but also ignore quarterback, ignore Johnny Manziel. He's back, love him. Kevin Sumlin, love him. Love the direction and trajectory of this program overall. But you don't lose your top offensive lineman, defensive lineman, linebacker, and defensive back, and just keep on clicking. You don't do it. And so I've got A&M at 10, and keep in mind, LSU and Bama beat up last year when they played them. They both have bye weeks before they play the Aggies this year.
Well, Josh, you know, the narrative that I'm hearing, Johnny Manziel will not be able to do what he did in the SEC in his second year. What do you think?
I don't think he will. And that's, listen, even if he comes back to the pack, he still could be the top quarterback in the country, because that's how far he was ahead of the pack last year. I just believe when you give a league full, it's not 1 or 2, a league full of defensive coordinators, the highest paid in the country, the chance to adjust to you, I think you'll see what that means when you play Alabama and LSU and Auburn, et cetera, this year. Number 9, Ohio State. Once again, this will shock many. Doesn't shock me at all. Same deal as A&M. You see a returning quarterback. You see an undefeated season last year. You see Urban Meyer's second year in Columbus. I'm a big believer typically in second-year head coaches and programs popping. But let me ask you this. Did anyone besides me pay attention to the fact that in that 2012 undefeated season last year against a garbage Big Ten schedule, they had 7-point or fewer wins against half their schedule? Cal, Michigan State, Indiana, Purdue, Wisconsin, and Michigan. They also trailed the mighty UAB Blazers midway through the second half. Add on top of that the fact that they lose 6 of 7 in that front 7 defensively, and that is your 2013 Buckeye team. Pardon me if I don't automatically pencil a squad like that into the BCS title game.
I think number 9 is pretty accurate for Ohio State, but I look at the landscape of the Big Ten, not very strong right now. You've got Brett Bielema from Wisconsin going to the SEC, and Michigan and Brady Hoke, not sure what they'll be, and they're the 2 biggest contenders to Ohio State, in my opinion.
Northwestern, potential trip-up game for them. Also, it's very possible that Ohio State and Michigan play final game of the regular season, and then again the Big Ten title game,
I would agree.
Which is terrible scheduling. Moving on, number 8, TCU. Serious dark horse team for me. TCU, I don't care so much about 2012 with them, and I'll tell you why. Casey Pascal returns at quarterback. They also had a number of starters that were all out last year along with that quarterback because they were suspended, so they all return this year. Completely different team. I could argue they upgraded every unit across the board, maybe besides offensive line, and historically, Gary Patterson and that TCU offensive line, they've always exceeded expectations. They've always risen above the level of what was expected. I love TCU not only because of that, but because I believe Casey Pascal has the makings of being the top signal caller in the Big 12 in a very, very untypically down year at quarterback overall for that conference. Love TCU this year.
But when you look at TCU, they're predicated on defense. Talk to me about how they're transitioning into the Big 12 where offense is key.
Well, they had a tough transition last year, but you got to remember, it's because defense is largely a rumor in that conference. And you have a lot of NFL quarterbacks. Typically, at your Texas and Oklahoma, et cetera, you don't have that this year. I mean, the number one guy in most preseason editions, magazines and whatnot, is David Ash at Texas. And he's done anything but light the world on fire. I would love them even more if their schedule set up a little bit better. Some teams in the Big 12 have 3 bye weeks this year, which is asinine, 10, 11, and 12, to steal a line from Stephen A. Smith. Florida State, it's another team. No one's bashed Florida State more than me for failing to meet preseason expectations and from underachieving relative to the massive amount of talent that they have on campus. If it's possible to lose a first-rounder at quarterback and upgrade at the quarterback position, I believe they do it this year. It's very ironic in that I believe they have overall, top to bottom, the most talented roster they've had in Fisher's tenure in Tallahassee, yet expectations seem to be the lowest that they've been. I love FSU in the ACC.
And it's amazing coming in with a freshman quarterback, Mr. Winston, see what he does in Tallahassee. I think Florida State has to really get a grip on the season early. They phased out a little bit and fizzled out in past years. I want to see what they can do this year.
Georgia, number 6. I apparently have 4 more questions about Georgia than everyone else does. No doubt they'll be potent offensively, but you don't click offensively every week. I've got Florida ahead of them at 5, which I'll talk about momentarily because I buy into defense, especially in the SEC, over offense. The bottom line is this. A, you got to deal with the fact that you play, as we said on the other side of the break, 3 top 10 caliber opponents your first 4 games of the season in Clemson, South Carolina, and LSU. Throw North Texas and a bye week in there. Eventually, that offense will not show up. Eventually, the Aaron Murray that we've seen in years past, occasionally in the fourth quarter, turnover-prone, mistake-prone, eventually that will happen in a big game. And defensively, they are going to have to rely on a defense that lost 11 guys, count it, nearly a dozen on one side of the ball alone to the NFL. And I don't believe Georgia can win a game defensively right now.
And you can literally call Georgia a no-name defense. Name 2 starters on that defense. Maybe the fan in Athens can do it, but I know I can't.
Yeah. Number 5, Florida. And please, I ask you, do not fall into the, well, remember the Sugar Bowl, remember the Louisville game crowd. Please don't do that. Rewind to 2007. Bama got skull-drugged by Utah in the Sugar Bowl. All they did was go undefeated in the regular season the next year, and in all likelihood, if anything, it helped them as opposed to hindering them. Also, and you look at offense, and that's really the only question with Florida, count me among those that believe you'll see significant improvement at the quarterback position with Jeff Driscoll under Brent Pease at the offensive coordinator spot in year 2. And also, it has a lot to do with that offensive line. An offensive line is going to be probably the best that it's been at that unit under Will Muschamp so far in his tenure in Gainesville.
I can agree, and I think bringing in big, strong, tall receivers for Jeff Driscoll will actually help him as well. You alluded to that offensive line. Replacing Mike Gillislee at running back will be an issue for Florida as well. But I think their offense will be pretty good, and I think their defense is amazing, one of the best in the country.
Yeah, they got a 5-star kid named Kelvin Taylor coming in. They've got, as you said, a number of big-time targets. Jordan Reed, tight end, was their number 1 pass-catching threat last year. So offensive evolution, if you will, going on in Gainesville right now, and I think Jeff Driscoll will reap the benefits. Number 4, Oregon. I hear Braxton Miller. I hear A.J. McCarron. I hear Aaron Murray's name in the, to me, meaningless preseason Heisman discussion. Where is Marcus Mariota's name in this? For my money, if I'm going to project in terms of what college football starter this year at quarterback projects best to the next level in the NFL, you got a guy that's 6'4", 215 pounds, rocket arm, sees the field very well, has been coached by now an NFL guy in Chip Kelly at Oregon. Why in the world are we overlooking Marcus Mariota?
Well, most people at 10:30 at night, Josh, are asleep. All they see about Oregon is highlights. You need to understand that Mariota is a weapon in himself. A misconception about Oregon, running quarterbacks, that's not true. Watch Mariota play, he can kill you from the pocket.
Yeah. The only thing that I would ask here is that previously I was of the opinion that it will be a seamless transition from Chip Kelly to Helfrich. I don't know about that because I think back to the Mike Bellotti to Chip Kelly transition. Bellotti left Oregon, left Eugene, and went to Bristol, Connecticut at ESPN. Whereas you lose a guy now in Chip Kelly that goes from Eugene to the NFL. And as good as Mark Helfrich may be, and he's been in that program a while, it'll be the same X's and O's style system offensively, same playbook, same terminology. It's very tough to lose an NFL caliber head coach and not at least have a dent left in your program.
I agree.
Number 3, Stanford. Preseason favorite of mine to not only win the Pac-12, but perhaps, if I'm going to write it in pencil right now, which is all I'll do in the preseason, appear in Pasadena in January in the BCS title game. We don't have enough time in this show for me to describe to you how much I love this program, how much respect I have for David Shaw. I would right now put him in the top 3 nationally in terms of coaches. Kevin Hogan back at quarterback. They lose 2 NFL tight ends, but overall, just because of the level at which they've recruited, which once again is ultra impressive considering the stringent academic requirements to even get into Stanford, I believe is just a slightly better version of what you had last year, and it all comes down, in my opinion, to a Thursday night. How crazy is that, by the way? A Thursday night showdown between, in all likelihood, 2 top 5 teams later on this year in Oregon and Stanford. I like Oregon to win the Pac-12, or rather Stanford to win the Pac-12, and I may like them to go as far as Pasadena.
And I'm like you, I love Stanford and I love David Shaw. Let's rewind to the Oregon-Stanford game last year. On the road in Eugene, Stanford manhandles the Ducks up front. It was very intriguing to me. I think Stanford and David Shaw have been able to transition from their time at Jim Harbaugh and not lose a beat.
South Carolina is my number 2 team, much higher than most people, but I fully believe if you were to put Alabama Crimson Tide jerseys on this roster, they would be a unanimous preseason number 1. Because the only doubt with South Carolina in people's minds is, well, they haven't done it before. We haven't seen them do it at the highest level. That's why Alabama gets benefit of the doubt every year. That's why in the past, SC, Texas, Oklahoma, they've gotten benefit of the doubt. I believe they've got the best defensive line in the country. I believe they've got 2 guys they can win with at quarterback, and Connor Shaw, Dylan Thompson. I don't believe the fall off from Marcus Lattimore at running back will be quite as steep. And overall, you know, for all the questions they have along the offensive line, I think the sum is greater than the individual parts there, and I believe they'll have enough to win the East. The schedule, it was so brutal for them last year. You had Georgia, LSU, Florida consecutively. It now tilts in their favor this year. Now Georgia's the one that has to play LSU. Georgia's the one with 3 top 10 teams first 4 weeks. I like South Carolina to win the East. I have them as high as number 2 overall.
Well, I agree with what you said, South Carolina coming back with a lot of talent, coming back with Steve Spurrier, but I also understand the sentiment that they haven't done it before. It is not that they just haven't done it. It's they haven't done it in the back half of the season. They've been notorious for fast starts and slow finishes. Let's see if this changes in 2013.
Number 1 team in the country is Alabama, and that's no shock. That's no news. Everyone will have Bama probably preseason number 1 or number 2. I just ask this. Is it possible to have you at number 1 and still consider you overrated? Because that's what I consider Alabama. I just pump the brakes, Tide fans. Pump the brakes. Please stop the NFL comparisons. Because the fact of the matter is, 7 times out of 10, Bama probably loses that LSU game last year. You could have just as easily lost the Georgia game. I say that to say this. I don't take anything away from their accomplishments in 2012. That was a national title, an SEC title that was well-deserved. It just goes to show the nature of this game. It's a game of inches. It's a game of centimeters. If 1 or 2 things go the other way, if 1 or 2 bounces of the ball go the other way last year, which could just as easily have happened, perception is completely different now. I like Alabama. I think they're the most talented team in the country. Ironically enough, I think it's offense that could carry this team, by the way.
And it's funny that you say offense can carry this team. 3 players, or 60% of that vaunted offensive line, are no longer with Alabama. They're now in the NFL. So seeing what they can do, blocking for T.J. Yeldon and A.J. McCarron, one of the most efficient quarterbacks in the SEC. I'm excited to see what Alabama does, but I do want to see how they perform at the offensive line position.
I think that went well. You know what? I think we're going to do this every week, every Tuesday. JP Poll, same time, same channel.
I'm ready for it.
Speaking of Alabama and Virginia Tech this Saturday night, kick it off in Atlanta, Chick-fil-A Kickoff Classic. We'll break that one down, as well as a showdown in the other Death Valley, as they would tell you in Baton Rouge. Georgia at Clemson. Who wins and why on the other side of the break? It is College Football Primetime. And welcome back to College Football Primetime. 23 past the hour. We are mere days away from the kickoff of the 2013 college football season, and we will get it kicked off in Atlanta Saturday night, the Chick-fil-A Kickoff Classic. Virginia Tech against Alabama. Jonathan, recently Alabama has been ultra successful in these neutral site openers. It's a pretty new fad, really, in college football. LSU's jumped on the bandwagon, as have a number of other programs in the Southeastern Conference. How about this? A very rare position for Virginia Tech. 17-point dogs, not on the road, but at a neutral site. That is a role of underdog, especially double-digit, that Frank Beamer's squad has not found itself in very much over his 34-year tenure, by the way, in Blacksburg.
And see, Virginia Tech's not used to being an underdog. They're also not used to going 7-6, which is what they went last year. 2 words, Josh. Logan Thomas. You have the opportunity to be the best quarterback in the ACC. There's no inconsistency. You have to be consistent. You have to be able to get the ball down the field. I think if he plays well, I'm not saying they win the game, but it's closer than a 17-point deficit.
It really surprised me last year to hear people preseason referring to Logan Thomas, the guy you just talked about, as a preseason favorite to be a first-round draft pick. I never personally saw it. Last year, the guy's touchdown to interception ratio was horrible. And you mentioned the fact that, yes, he physically has all the tools to be the best quarterback in the ACC, maybe the best quarterback in the country, but so far he has not put it together. And they're a 17-point dog here for a reason. I would just caution people, be very careful, because I have a hard time laying double digits for a team that not only outclasses you, both in terms of experience and depth along both lines, as Virginia Tech does against Alabama. More experience, more returning starters, offensive and defensive lines, but also when you got a returning guy at quarterback with something to prove, and you couple that with a veteran head coach, they've been in this game before. They've been there against Alabama before. 2009, they lost 34-24, but gave the Tide a very good game. I don't think the gap, at least, between these two programs is nearly as wide as the perception would lead you to believe.
Well, one thing about Virginia Tech, I really haven't seen the fundamental soundness that they've had in the past. Can they bring that to week 1 in the Georgia Dome? If not, Alabama will have an opportunity to run over them like the 17-point deficit says. And, Josh, I just don't know what Frank Beaver is going to do. He's been more of an enigma in the landscape of college football as opposed to what he was 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, basically for me, this all comes down to, can you crank up that running game against Alabama? Because if you can't run it against Alabama, you know, even these spread teams that have had success against Bama, they've been able to establish the run. If you can't do that, I don't think you have any prayer. And you may have a chance because early on, I think within the first half of this game, you'll kind of get a sense of how this game's going to go. You think about that nose tackle position in that 3-4 defense that Kirby Smart and that Alabama defense feature. You've had in the past Terrence Cody, more recently Jesse Williams, Brandon Ivory, a new starter there, steps in. And for all the talent that you go back and look at with that 2010 Alabama team that woefully underachieved relative to preseason expectations anyway, what you were missing up front is the ability to stuff the run that you've had in every other year. And they couldn't stop the run in 2010 when it mattered the most. Brandon Ivory has looked solid, had to play significant minutes against Georgia when Jesse Williams went out in the SEC title game. If they can stuff the run against Virginia Tech, I don't think the Hokies have much of a shot in this game. And for that matter, I don't see anyone else in the conference outside of possibly LSU and Georgia that could counter what Alabama brings, because you got to believe they're going to put up points every week now offensively.
And see, you talk defense, and that's what I'm talking about offensively. I know the receiver Kenny Bell was hurt a lot last year. You've got Norwood coming back for his senior season. I want to see what Alabama does in terms of balance. That's the one thing that they've had over the past 3 out of 4 years is balance. If A.J. McCarron can come in and be as efficient as he's been, it's hard to see Virginia Tech playing football and beating Alabama.
I'm going to take a close game, maybe until the third quarter. I think Bama pulls away. I assume you're taking the Tide as well.
I agree.
Shifting our gears and shifting attention rather up the road, Clemson, South Carolina. This is a night game, by the way. Night kickoff, rare road kickoff out of conference for the Georgia Bulldogs. Georgia open, by the way, 2-point favorite. That line has now shifted. Clemson is a 1.5-point favorite. Sammy Watkins has run his mouth the entire offseason. Usually, by the way, guys that run their mouth in the offseason do most of the talking in the offseason.
It's that Richard Sherman disease, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Seattle,
you know, very rarely do you see a guy run his mouth in the offseason and then have confetti raining down around him in January.
Right.
But that remains to be seen for Clemson. I definitely think they have the squad to do it, by the way. If there's one thing Clemson has been known for, though, if there's one area they've been consistent in the past, it was inconsistency. Last year, they bucked that trend, though. They lost 2 games, but the 2 teams they lost to went a combined 25-4. So they really won the games they were supposed to, and they lost the big games last year. So it's time to take that next step. You know I don't put a ton of stock in bowl games, but I was overly impressed with the way that Clemson was able to hang with, specifically in the trenches, LSU in that Chick-fil-A game last year. Now, I shoot down any notion that the Sugar Bowl mattered for Florida, but I pick and choose my spots in bowl season where I put some stock into what I see. I really think Clemson, personnel-wise, has what it takes to go toe-to-toe with an SEC team. And also, remember, I think it's worst-case scenario for Georgia. Going on the road week 1 and having to take that defense, replacing 11 guys that you sent to the league, hostile environment, returning quarterback, all kind of weapons offensively for Clemson. I think that they'll have a much better run game, by the way, than people anticipate after they lost Ellington to the NFL draft. I've been kind of on the fence here. I am slightly leaning Clemson, though.
Well, if you look at Logan Thomas at Virginia Tech, I said he has the tools. Taj Boyd has proven what he can do in the ACC. Now, you said losing Ellington is going to be big. They'll have a bevy of running backs coming in. How can Georgia stop the run? They had 11 players, like you said, go to the NFL. They still had trouble stopping the run last year. If Clemson can come in, dictate the line of scrimmage, and have Taj Boyd and Sammy Watkins on the outside, Clemson may have a shot. I still like Georgia in this game, but I think it'll be very tight.
Here is something fun to ponder. Preseason, Georgia, probably a consensus top 5 team. Preseason, everyone high on Mark Richt, especially after the performance that he and his squad turned in last year. If they lose in week 1, now that's not a conference game, but I believe for all intents and purposes that makes week 2 a proverbial must-win game against South Carolina at home. How quickly could the narrative shift on Georgia? First 2 weeks of the season, you're playing 2 top 10 teams. I know the people in Athens expect 1-1 worst case, but what if 0-2 happens?
But see, there's one thing to have a slow start in the SEC, but if you have a slow start with the gauntlet that they call a schedule, there may be no recovering for Georgia. I think they'll be good. I actually think they'll come in second in the SEC East after Florida this year, but I just don't know what they can do if they fall behind and get off to an 0-2 or an 0-3 start.
We'll wrap it up. Other side of the break, college football primetime. Stay with us. And welcome back to College Football Primetime. Final segment of the evening. Got a Twitter question here, by the way. Very interesting. We were talking about Bama, Virginia Tech a couple of minutes ago. Hokie Fan 33 asks, is Frank Beamer still a top 10 coach?
If you look at the past, he is a top 10 coach. But if you look at the present, I can't say that. Not with the emergence with coaches such as the James Franklin and Vanderbilt and the David Shaw. I put him outside my top 10 slightly, but I still do put stock in Frank Beamer.
I mentioned earlier, I said he was been there 34 years. This is actually his 27th season in Blacksburg. The answer is no. And the key here is he still? That's what the fan asks. Is he still a top 10 coach? Here's the fact of the matter. The ACC is a completely different world than the SEC. And Frank Beamer, I don't think, would have a job still in the SEC. That being said, I have a ton of respect for what he's done in Virginia Tech because the people in Blacksburg remember what they were before Frank Beamer, by the way. Mm-hmm. And that carries a lot of stock, especially with Hokie fans. Also, Facebook question. Ben Williams asks, do you see any team out there that can end the SEC's 7-year BCS title streak?
I do see the team, and the team is on the West Coast, and his name is Stanford. The way David Shaw runs that program, physical nature that they have and the way that they recruit and plug people in, I think if any team could do it, Stanford could do it, but I don't think it'll happen.
Here's the team that I name Alabama, LSU, Georgia, South Carolina. Those are the teams that can end the SEC's 7-year BCS title streak, and what I mean by that is this. Eventually, this league will cannibalize itself one season, and the best way to make sure the SEC doesn't win a BCS title is to make sure there are no SEC teams in the BCS title game. Mm-hmm. And I could just as easily see an Ohio State-Stanford matchup as I could an Alabama-Stanford matchup.
And we spoke about it earlier when you have the opportunity to maybe not go to a 9-game schedule and those SEC teams knock each other out, there will be no more LSU-Alabama rematches for the national championship. So I think that's a very viable option.
Well, that'll wrap us up for tonight. For everyone here at College Football Primetime until tomorrow night, he's Jonathan. I'm Josh. We'll see you.